Now, oftentimes when you're creating pipelines, oftentimes the steps of going from source code all the way to a deployment, those steps are fairly similar, right, or even identical, right? If it's just a Java code, right, it's pretty much the same thing, right? You're on Java C, you run the tests on that, you package it into a jar file, and then you deploy it wherever the production environment is, right? Now, usually, oftentimes, you want to use the same identical steps, but for different environments, right? And the different environments might have a different different configuration, right? They might have different databases. They might have different network. They might have different credentials, username and passwords. They might have all sorts of things that are specific to the different environments. So oftentimes, you want to be able to parameterize the pipeline so that you can apply the same pipeline, but to different environments. Okay, where you can configure things that are specific to the different environments. Environments might be in the QA environment or the development environment, the staging environment, the demo environment. Each one with their own set of parameters. Different databases, different networks, different queues. So Jenkins allows you to declare these parameters in an element that's called parameters, and where you can give the names of the parameters, an initial value, and an input field that would allow folks to enter the values of these parameters, right? And then you can then use those parameters as part of the build, right? So you can configure it and run it, using this database, the QA database when you're building for QA, to use the stage database when you're trying to deploy to staging, or use the performance database when you're trying to deploy to performance, right? Or then production when you're trying to deploy to production. So you're allowed to use the same type of steps to deploy, but for different environments. So let's take a look at if we copy this and create a pipeline here. And do a param S3, and this is just a pipeline. We can paste that Jenkins file here and save it and run it. Now the first time around, it'll use the default value, right? Because notice that the parameter had a default value for that hello, but if you refresh, what will happen? Notice this build now here. If I refresh this, it says build with parameter instead, meaning it realized that there were parameters in the Jenkins file. It says, wait a minute, you can configure this, right? You can give me values for QA, or a different value for staging, a different value for production, and different values, and you can run it, and then it can ask you, what value do you want to use for that particular parameter, right? So instead of hello, you might type a goodbye, right? And then you can run this with that particular value, and then see what the results of having run it with that particular parameter. So for instance, instead of having said I didn't mean goodbye world. Yeah, hello world, or Jenkins rocks, or something else, but not goodbye. Sorry. Yeah, Jenkins rocks. So you can parameterize this for the different environments. Now you can also go further and specify multiple steps, right? If the scripts is something fairly complex, where you might have for loops, where you might have all sorts of complex commands, you can specify them in long lines, using the triple quotation. Or if these are really, really long, you can instead have separate files, right, that live outside of Jenkins, right, that are written in your favorite scripting language, right, and then run it and refer to them from within Jenkins, right. You can say, here's a toy sample of a shell script, right, that calculates the Fibonacci numbers, but it could be written in anything, right. If you prefer Java or Python or whatever other scripting language that that you would prefer, you can just as easily refer to them from within Jenkins, right, and run it from the shell command and do whatever you need to do for your deployment environment. Okay, for this to work, obviously you would need access to the machine, or to the remote machine, and perhaps even set up the correct permissions. That certainly Jenkins will need to have permissions to run these shell scripts from within Jenkins. Usually, what would happen is that all these scripts, you would provide them to a productions or a deployment engineer, right, who is responsible for Jenkins, right, and they can set this up for us. Right, in this case, it would be perhaps Alex Grob, who owns all these machines and can set up and administer all this for us. Typically, you would not have access directly to these machines. Also, multiple stages, as I mentioned earlier. So it might be that, or it's often the case, right, that you want to group a lot of these steps within a particular stage, a logical stage, such as build or test or package or deploy, which might have multiple steps, right? And you want to make sure that you can abort or stop or look at the status of each individual stage individually, so that you can tackle any problems that you might have for that particular stage. So, for instance, here's the first stage running, and then the second stage running, and then they are logically represented in Jenkins graphically as boxes, right? Each for where you would have the logs and the status for each one of the stages. All right, let's take a look at integrating Jenkins with GitHub.